They noticed her coat before they noticed her. That was how it always started. The coat was clean, it was pressed, it was 5 years old, and it showed every one of those years in the way fabric shows time, faithfully, without apology. And in less than 2 minutes, 3 women who considered themselves pillars of that community were going to make sure Grace knew they had noticed. What they didn't know, what none of them had ever thought to ask, was why she was wearing it, and what that coat had cost her to keep. Hi, I'm Luna, and this is Poppy. Today's story takes place on a Sunday morning in a church that called itself a community. It's about a woman who showed up week after week in the same worn coat, and the women who decided that coat told them everything they needed to know about her. They were wrong. They were wrong in a way that would take their breath away when they found out. Stay with us. If you've ever been judged for what you couldn't afford while doing everything you could for the people you love, this story is for you. Stay until the end. Grace Adimi had been attending Calvary Community Church for 4 years. She had started going the winter after her husband Thomas died, not because faith had arrived suddenly, but because something in her had needed a room full of people who believed things were going to be okay. Thomas had been 41, a delivery driver. He had left for work on a Tuesday morning and had not come home. The accident had been sudden, and the grief had been the kind that arrives all at once and then stays, taking up residence in the ordinary moments, the Tuesday mornings, the coffee cups, the particular silence of a house that used to have more sound in it. Grace had 2 children. Marcus was 12, serious, responsible in the way of oldest children who understand, without being told, that something has shifted in the household and that they have a role in the new arrangement. Lily was 9, still fully herself, still able to find joy in small things with the unguarded ease of a child, who has been loved consistently enough to trust the world. Grace worked to keep her that way. She worked 3 jobs to keep both of them exactly who they were. Monday through Friday, she cleaned offices in the commercial district downtown, early mornings, starting at 5, finished by 9, so she could get Marcus and Lily to school. 3 evenings a week, she worked the dinner shift at a family restaurant 2 miles from home, where the owner, a man named Mr. Assay, who had known Thomas, had given her the most flexible scheduling he could manage. Saturday mornings, she ironed and folded laundry for 2 households in the neighborhood, an arrangement that had started as a favor and had become a small but reliable income. None of the women at Calvary knew any of this. They had never asked. And still, that wasn't what they saw when she walked through the door. She did not complain about any of this, not to her children, not to her sister in Atlanta who called every Sunday, not to the women at the church who asked, occasionally, and with the specific brightness of people who expect a manageable answer, how she was getting on. She was getting on. That was the answer, and it was true, and it was also, she understood, not the complete picture. The complete picture was longer and heavier and not suited to church hallway conversations. The coat had been Thomas's gift. 5 years ago, before the accident, he had saved for 3 months and surprised her with it on her birthday. It was a good coat, not expensive by any standard that mattered to the women at Calvary, but well-made and chosen with the specific care of a man who had paid attention to what his wife liked. She had not bought a new coat since he died, not because she had forgotten, because every time the money approached something like enough, something else had needed it first. Marcus's school shoes, Lily's medication in February, the heating unit in November. The coat was fine. The coat still worked. The coat could wait. The coat had been waiting for 3 years, and every Sunday she wore it, she thought of Thomas. That was not nothing. Sunday was the day she did not count things. Not the hours, not the dollars, not the distance between where they were and where she was trying to get them. She had learned somewhere in the 2nd year after Thomas that if she counted everything all the time, the counting would become the whole of her life. So Sunday was the day she stopped counting and simply arrived. She arrived in the coat. She arrived with her children. She arrived with the particular quiet dignity of someone who has decided that showing up is itself a form of abundance. She had not asked anyone to understand this. She had not expected them to. She had simply kept coming. Calvary Community Church had, like most communities, an inner circle. It was not official. There was no list, no ceremony, no moment of admission. It had simply formed, over years, around the women who had the most time, the most money, and the most investment in how the community presented itself to the world. At the center of it was Patricia Holt. Patricia was 52, the wife of a commercial contractor, and had been attending Calvary for 20 years. She organized the fundraisers. She chaired the hospitality committee. She knew everyone's business and distributed this knowledge with the particular precision of someone who understands that information, carefully managed, is a form of power. Beside her, on most Sundays, were Diane and Sandra Wells. Diane was 48, elegant, the kind of woman who wore real jewelry on a Sunday morning and considered this appropriate. Sandra was 45, Patricia's closest friend, quick with a laugh that was not always kind. They had noticed Grace on her second Sunday. They had categorized her quickly and without much discussion, the way people categorize what they consider simple information. Poor widow. That coat. They were not without charity. That would be too simple and also inaccurate. They had organized food drives. They had donated to the benevolence fund. They had individually been genuinely kind to people they considered deserving of kindness. But there was a difference in their unexamined understanding between charity and community. Charity was for people who needed help. Community was for people like them. Grace, in their assessment, fell into the first category. She had never been invited into the second. If you've ever watched someone judge a person without knowing a single thing about what that person carries, leave a like on this story, because Grace deserves to be seen, and so does every person like her. This was not a conscious cruelty. That was the most important thing to understand about it. Patricia and her circle did not gather on Tuesday mornings to plan their treatments of Grace Adimi. They did not discuss her at length or with malice. They discussed her the way people discuss what they consider minor and obvious, briefly, in passing, with the casual confidence of people who believe they have already understood something that was, in its own way, worse. Deliberate cruelty can be named and confronted. Casual dismissal is harder to hold in your hands. It keeps sliding through. They had already decided who Grace was. And the most dangerous thing about a decision like that is how invisible it is to the person making it. The first incident had happened in October, in the church hallway after the service. Grace had been helping Lily with her shoe when Patricia had walked past with two friends and said, loudly enough to carry, "That poor woman, same coat every week. Someone should say something to Pastor Williams about the benevolence fund." She had said it with genuine concern in her voice. That was the complicated part. She had meant it as compassion. She had not understood that compassion expressed at someone's expense, without their knowledge or consent, is not compassion. It is something else. Grace had heard it. She had finished with Lily's shoe. She had stood up and taken her daughter's hand and walked to the car. She had not said anything. She had sat in the car for a moment before starting it. She had thought, I am wearing the coat my husband chose for me. She had started the car. The second incident had been at the Christmas social in December. The women of Calvary had organized a gift exchange, a formal one, with a price minimum that Grace had seen posted on the bulletin board and had quietly not attended, sending Marcus and Lily with a plate of cookies she had baked at midnight instead. Diane had said to Sandra, in the kitchen where Grace was helping with the dishes, "Did you see she sent the children without a gift?" Some people just don't understand how these things work, Sandra had said. To be fair, maybe she couldn't. Diane had said, if you can't participate, maybe don't come. She had said it quietly, not quietly enough. Grace had been holding a serving dish. She had set it down carefully. She had dried her hands. She had gone to find her children. The third incident, the one that settled something in Grace permanently, had been in February, on a Sunday when the temperature had dropped overnight, and the car had not started, and she had walked the 6 blocks to church with Marcus and Lily because they had not missed Sunday in 4 years, and she was not going to start now. They had arrived with cold cheeks and damp coats. Patricia had looked at them in the entrance and said, to no one in particular, but to the general air, she walks them here in this weather? In those coats? It was not the words, it was the tone. The particular tone of someone describing a problem they consider someone else's failure to solve. Marcus had heard it. Grace had seen him hear it. She had put her hand on his shoulder, just for a moment, just enough to say, I know. And it doesn't define us. She had smiled at Patricia. Later in the car, Lily had said, Mom, why does that lady always look at us like that? Grace had looked at her daughter in the rearview mirror, 9 years old, still fully herself. Still asking the honest questions that adults had learned to stop asking. Grace had said, some people look at what they can see and think that that's all there is. Lily had said, that's not very smart. Grace had said, no, it isn't. She had looked back at the road. She had thought, my daughter just said in 9 words what I have been living for 4 years. Patricia had not noticed. She was already talking about something else. That evening, Grace made dinner and helped Lily with homework and listened to Marcus describe a project he was working on at school. She did these things with her full attention, the way she always did. She had a rule she had made for herself after Thomas died. Whatever was in front of her got all of her. Not most of her. All of her. The church was in front of her on Sundays. The children were in front of her always. The women of Calvary and their particular form of concern were not in front of her in any way that required her sustained attention. She had decided this deliberately, not from indifference. She felt it each time. But she had decided that what those women thought of her coat was not a fact about her coat. It was a fact about them, and she was not responsible for their facts. What the women of Calvary did not know about Grace Adimi could fill a room. They did not know that Marcus had been accepted into a competitive academic program at his school, one that required additional materials and testing fees that Grace had paid by giving up the 2 days of laundry work she normally kept for household emergencies. They did not know that Lily had a small recurring health condition that required a prescription that cost, after insurance, $41 a month, and that in the months when the heating bill or a school expense arrived at the same time, Grace went without her own medication for blood pressure to cover it. They did not know that Grace had, in the past 2 years, quietly organized a meal rotation for 3 elderly members of the congregation, who lived alone and whose families visited infrequently. She had done this without telling anyone, not the pastor, not the hospitality committee, not the women who chaired the official outreach programs. She had simply noticed that Brother Clarence ate alone on Sundays, and that Sister Mabel had mentioned twice that she hadn't had a home-cooked meal since her daughter moved away, and that Mr. Foster's refrigerator, which she had glimpsed once when she dropped off some soup, contained almost nothing. So she cooked a little extra every Sunday and dropped it off on the way home. It was not a program. It was not organized. It was simply what she did. The women of Calvary organized fundraisers for hunger relief. Grace fed the hungry people in the building. She had never mentioned this to anyone. And there was one more thing they did not know. Patricia Holt's mother, Evelyn, was 81 years old and lived in a small apartment on Birch Street, 4 blocks from Grace's house. Evelyn had been a member of Calvary for 40 years, but had stopped attending 3 years ago when her mobility had declined and her pride had prevented her from asking for help. Patricia visited on alternate Sundays. Between those visits, Evelyn was largely alone. Grace had met Evelyn at the pharmacy 18 months ago. Evelyn had been trying to reach a shelf she couldn't quite reach, and Grace had gotten it for her. And they had talked for 20 minutes in the aisle about nothing in particular. And something about the old woman's careful dignity had reminded Grace of her own mother, who had died when Grace was 24. She had started stopping by, not every day, not on a schedule, just when she was passing and had a few minutes and had thought to bring something, a piece of fruit, a container of stew, a book Lily had finished that she thought Evelyn might like. Evelyn had never told Patricia about the visits, not because she was hiding them, because Evelyn was a woman who had spent 81 years not making a fuss, and in her understanding, mentioning Grace's visits would be making a fuss. So she had said nothing. What they had was simple and therefore difficult to describe. They drank tea, they watched television programs that Evelyn liked and Grace had never seen. They talked about Thomas sometimes. Evelyn had known him slightly, from his years attending the church, and she remembered things about him that Grace had not known anyone else remembered. Grace had cried once on a Tuesday evening in October, when Evelyn had mentioned something Thomas had said at a church picnic 8 years ago, something small and characteristic and completely him, and Grace had realized she had been afraid of forgetting his voice. Evelyn had not made a fuss about the crying. She had simply refilled the tea and waited. That was the thing about Evelyn. She understood that some things needed to be felt without being managed. She had learned this in 81 years of living, and she offered it freely. It was, Grace thought, one of the most generous things one person could give another. And Grace had said nothing. And for 18 months in the quiet space between Patricia's alternate Sundays, an unlikely friendship had grown between an 81-year-old woman and the person her daughter had dismissed as that poor woman in the worn coat. Patricia received the call at 8:40 on a Sunday morning as she was walking from her car to the church entrance. It was her mother. Evelyn had fallen the previous evening, not badly, nothing broken, but badly enough that she had been frightened, and she had called the one person she knew would come without making her feel like a burden. She had called Grace. Grace had gone at 9 o'clock on a Saturday night, after her shift at the restaurant, still in her work clothes. She had helped Evelyn from the floor to the chair. She had checked her carefully, hands, wrists, the way she was sitting, the color of her face. She had made tea. She had not hesitated when the call came. There was no version of receiving that call and not going. Evelyn had asked, and Grace had learned, from Thomas, from her own mother, from years of watching what happened when people said they would help later. That later was the most expensive word in the language of care. Grace did not deal in later. She dealt in now, and in showing up, and in staying until the breathing settled. She had stayed for 2 hours, until Evelyn's breathing had settled back to its normal rhythm, and she had fallen asleep in the chair with the television on low. Then, Grace had locked the door with the spare key Evelyn had given her months ago, walked home in the dark, and gone to bed at midnight. She had been up at 4:34 her morning shift. Patricia had not known any of this. Now, standing in the church parking lot with her phone pressed to her ear, she was learning it. Evelyn said, "Grace came. She always comes when I need her. I should have told you sooner, but I didn't want you to. Ori and I didn't want to make a fuss." Patricia said, "Who is Grace?" Evelyn said, "Grace from the church, the one with the 2 children, the one in the..." She stopped. Then she said very quietly, "The one you don't always treat very kindly, Patricia." Patricia stood in the parking lot. The service was starting in 20 minutes. She did not move. Patricia sat through the service. The rest of her attention was occupied by the image of her mother, 81 years old, still in her work clothes from a restaurant shift, coming through the door and making tea. She looked across the church at Grace. Grace was in her usual seat, 3 rows from the back. Marcus sat beside her, reading the program with the focused attention he brought to everything. Lily was drawing something small and quiet on the back of her bulletin. Grace was listening to the sermon with her hands folded in her lap, and the particular stillness of someone who has learned to be present in a room that has not always been kind to her. Patricia had been in this room every Sunday for 20 years. She had never really looked at Grace before. She was looking now. After the service, Patricia found Grace in the parking lot. Grace was helping Lily with her coat zipper. She looked up when she heard her name. Patricia said, "My mother called me this morning. She told me what you've been doing." Grace said, "Is she all right? She seemed fine when I left, but..." Patricia said, "She's fine. She's more than fine. She stopped. Reorganized. She said, "How long have you been going to see her?" Grace said, "About 18 months. Patricia said, "Why?" Grace looked at her for a moment. She said, "Because she reminded me of my mother, and because she was alone on the Sundays when you weren't there, and because it seemed like the right thing to do." She said it without accusation, without any visible awareness that the woman she was talking to had, 3 months earlier, described her to a group of friends as a charity case who didn't know how to dress herself. She said it simply, as someone stating a fact about a choice she had made and did not consider remarkable. Patricia looked at this woman. She looked with different eyes than she had used on any of the other Sundays. Not the eyes that filed and categorized and moved on. Eyes that were trying, finally, to actually see. She saw a woman who had walked 6 blocks in winter with her children, rather than miss a Sunday. A woman who had baked cookies at midnight because the price minimum was beyond her reach, but the desire to contribute was not. A woman who had been coming, week after week, to a room that had never once made her fully welcome, and had kept coming anyway. Not because the room deserved it, because Grace had decided, somewhere early in her grief and her rebuilding, that she would not let other people's smallness determine the size of her own life. At the coat, at the children, at the face of someone who had been feeding her mother and sitting with her mother and keeping her mother from being alone, while Patricia had been organizing fundraisers and managing committees and making sure her own good works were properly credited. She felt something she had not felt in a long time. Not guilt, exactly. Something more specific than guilt. The particular shame of someone who has been looking at a situation entirely wrong for a very long time and has just been shown the correct view. Patricia said, "I have said things over the past few years that were unkind. About your coat, about your children. I said them in the kind of way where you think because you're not saying them directly to someone, they don't count." She paused. She said, "They count. I knew they could reach you, and I said them anyway. That was wrong." Grace said, "Yes." She said it without softening it. Not unkindly, but not falsely. She had been waiting, she realized, for exactly this. Not for revenge, not for the moment to be worse than it was, but for the truth to be named. 4 years of Sundays. 4 years of wearing the coat without apology and being appraised without invitation. For years of her children sitting in those pews absorbing, without knowing the word for it, what it meant to be tolerated rather than welcomed. And now, the woman who had done most of the appraising was standing in a parking lot asking for the truth to be named. Grace named it. Without malice. Without satisfaction. Just clearly. Patricia said, "I didn't know what you were carrying." Grace said, "You didn't ask." Another quiet moment. Patricia said, "No, I didn't." She said, "I'd like to, if you'd let me." Grace looked at her. She thought about 4 years of Sunday mornings, about the coat, about Marcus hearing himself categorized in a church hallway, about Lily drawing quietly on her bulletin while women nearby decided what kind of person her mother was. She thought about Evelyn, who had never made a fuss, about what it meant to extend grace, the act, not the name, to people who had not earned it. She said, "All right, 2 words, not a full pardon, not a friendship yet." a door, left open just enough for something honest to begin. Patricia drove home slowly. She thought about the coat. She thought about how many times she had looked at it and seen a problem instead of a person. She thought about her mother's voice on the phone, the one you don't always treat very kindly, Patricia. Her mother, who had never in 81 years said an unkind word about anyone, had said it the way Evelyn said everything, quietly, without performance, without anger. Had said it because it was true, and because she had decided it was time to say it. Patricia pulled into her driveway. She sat in the car for a while. She thought, I've been attending a church for 20 years, and a woman with 3 jobs and 2 children and a coat her late husband chose for her has been living the thing I have been pretending to practice. She sat with that for as long as it took to fully arrive. Then she went inside. Then she called her mother. Then she started thinking about what she was going to do differently. Patricia told Diane and Sandra the following Sunday, not everything, not with full detail, but enough. She said, I've been getting Grace wrong. We've been getting her wrong. I think we owe her a different kind of attention than we've been giving her. Diane had been quiet for a moment. Then she said, what do you mean? Patricia said, I mean, we've been deciding what she is without knowing anything about what she does. And I'm finding out that what she does is considerably more than what we've been giving her credit for, Sandra said. The visiting. You mentioned she visits your mother, Patricia said. Among other things, the conversation that followed was not comfortable. It was honest, which is frequently worse. But honesty, unlike comfort, tends to leave something useful behind. Grace did not know about this conversation. She would not have wanted to. She had not done any of the things she did in order to be credited for them. She continued visiting Evelyn. She continued dropping off food on Sunday afternoons. She continued showing up every Sunday in the coat that had been Thomas's gift and that she had decided. Sometime in the past few months, she was no longer going to apologize for, even silently. It was, after all, a good coat. It was pressed every Saturday night. It was clean. It was the coat a man had saved 3 months to give her because he had been paying attention to what she loved. She wore it because it still kept her warm. She wore it because it still worked. She wore it because she was done explaining herself to people who had not earned the explanation. And because every time she put it on, she thought of Thomas. And that was enough. That had always been enough. In May, Patricia organized a different kind of Sunday social, a potluck, no price minimum, bring what you can. She had not announced that this was for any particular reason, but Grace had been asked specifically and in person if she would bring her jollof rice, which Evelyn had mentioned once in passing to Patricia was the best she had ever tasted. Grace had brought 2 large pots. They were empty before the afternoon was half over. She had stood in that church hall and been thanked genuinely and repeatedly for the first time in 4 years of Sundays. Marcus had noticed. He had watched his mother move through that room, the same room where he had heard his family discussed like a problem to be managed, and he had seen people approach her with warmth rather than charity. On the way home, he had said, Mom, people were actually talking to you today, Grace had said. They were? He had said, is that going to keep happening? She had looked at her son. She had said, I hope so. But either way, we keep showing up. She had said, that's what we do. He had been quiet after that for a block or 2. Then he had said, Dad would have liked today. Grace had felt it, the particular sharpness of an unexpected thing that is also exactly right. She had said, yes, he would have. He would have. Thomas had loved a room full of people sharing food. He had loved the specific noise of it, the overlapping conversations, the particular warmth of people who have eaten together and felt the better for it. She had made his jollof rice recipe, the same one he had learned from his mother that she had learned from him, that she now made from memory so practiced it had become her own. She had brought him into that room in the only way she still could. And the room had been fed. And the room had been glad. And that, she thought, walking home with her children in the April afternoon was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. There is a particular kind of cruelty that wears the costume of concern. It looks at someone and decides, quickly, without asking, without looking, that it understands their situation. That the coat, the shoes, the absence of the right gift tells the whole story. It calls this wisdom. It calls this discernment. It is neither. It is judgment. And judgment without knowledge is just assumption with an audience. Patricia and her friends were not monsters. They were people who had stopped asking questions. People who had decided that what they could see was all there was to see. And in a community built on the belief that people are more than what they appear, that was a particular kind of failure. Grace never performed her goodness. She never announced the meals, the visits, the Sunday evenings at Evelyn's kitchen table. She did them because they needed to be done, and she was the person who noticed they needed to be done. That is a kind of faith that doesn't require a building. And the coat that told those women everything they thought they needed to know. The coat that her husband had chosen for her. The coat she had worn every winter since he died because it still worked and because every time she put it on, she thought of him. They looked at that coat and saw poverty. They should have looked more carefully. They might have seen love. So if you have ever been judged by what you wear, what you drive, what you can or cannot afford to bring to the table, know this. The people who are too busy judging your coat have no idea what you are carrying inside it. Keep showing up. Keep doing the quiet work. Keep being the person who notices what needs to be done and does it. Because that is the kind of person who, one day, without trying, without performing, without asking for anything, changes a room. If Grace's story stayed with you, if it reminded you that kindness doesn't require an audience, please like this video and subscribe to Poppy Tylees. Leave us a comment. Have you ever been judged for something on the outside when nobody knew what was happening on the inside? We read every single one. And if you know someone who shows up quietly and does the work that nobody sees, share this story with them. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is say, I see what you're carrying. Thank you for being here. I'm Luna. This is Poppy. Until next time.